In the bitter cold of Wyoming Territory, 1887, a white wedding dress gleams against endless snow. Inside lies Sarah Mitchell, a bride abandoned at the altar and left to freeze in a merciless blizzard. Her legs, claimed by frostbite, tell a story of unthinkable betrayal. But fate has other plans. Through the howling storm rides Thomas Cooper, a down-on-his-luck cowboy, with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back. When he spots that flash of white against the drifts, he doesn't hesitate. Despite his own desperate circumstances, he carries her to his humble cabin, where the warmth of human kindness begins to thaw more than just frozen limbs. As Sarah fights for survival and Thomas tends her wounds with gentle determination, a connection deeper than words takes root in the silence of their shared solitude. What will a penniless cowboy do with a legless bride who has nowhere else to go? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the Wyoming wilderness like a wounded beast, driving sheets of snow before it. Thomas Cooper hunched lower in his worn leather saddle, his threadbare coat offering little protection against the bitter February cold. His horse, Buck, pressed forward with dogged determination, both rider and mount knowing they needed shelter soon. 20 years of working cattle had taught Thomas to read the weather, and this storm was turning deadly. His planned journey to the next town would have to wait. He'd seen an abandoned chapel a mile back. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. That's when he saw it, a flash of white against white, somehow different from the surrounding snow. Thomas pulled Buck to a halt, squinting through the swirling flakes. There, half buried in a drift, lay something that didn't belong in this desolate landscape. A wedding dress. His numb fingers fumbled with Buck's reins as he dismounted. The snow had drifted nearly waist-deep around the chapel's weathered walls. Thomas waded through it, his heart pounding harder with each step. As he drew closer, he saw that the dress wasn't empty. A woman lay there, her skin nearly as white as her gown. Dark hair spilled across the snow, and her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that made his blood run cold. He dropped to his knees, beside her, pressing trembling fingers against her neck, praying for a pulse. There, faint but steady. "Ma'am?" His voice was hoarse from the cold. "Can you hear me?" No response. He brushed snow from her face, noting her delicate features and youth. She couldn't be more than 25. What in God's name was she doing? Out here, dressed like a bride in the middle of a blizzard? Thomas didn't waste time pondering. She'd freeze to death if he didn't act fast. He slipped his arms beneath her, and as he lifted, he noticed something that made his stomach lurch. Below her knees, her legs were solid, frozen through. Frostbite. Bad. Cursing under his breath, he cradled her against his chest and struggled. Back to Buck. The horse stood patient and steady as Thomas managed to mount while holding the unconscious woman. He arranged her across his lap as best he could, wrapping his coat around them both. "Home, Buck," he urged, turning the horse into the wind. "Fast as you can, boy." The next half hour was a brutal test of endurance. Thomas could barely feel his hands on the reins, but he kept them steady through sheer force of will. The woman remained limp in his arms, her breathing shallow but present. He found himself talking to her, though she couldn't hear. "Stay with me, ma'am. Just a little further. Got a cabin up ahead. It ain't much, but it's warm and dry. You just hold on." His own modest homestead had never looked so welcoming as when it finally emerged from the swirling white. Thomas had built it himself 5 years ago, a simple one-room cabin with a lean-to for Buck. Not much to look at, but right now it meant the difference between life and death. He managed to dismount without dropping his precious burden, though. His frozen legs nearly buckled. Buck would have to wait in the lean-to. The woman needed attention first. Thomas shouldered open the cabin door, ducking inside with her. The embers in his fireplace still glowed faintly from that morning. Laying her gently on his narrow bed, Thomas moved with the urgency of a man who understood time was running out. He stoked the fire, added wood, and grabbed every blanket he owned. Only then did he turn his full attention to the woman's condition. Her wedding dress was soaked through, and her skin felt like ice. The frostbite on her legs was worse than he'd first thought. Thomas had seen it before in his years out here, knew what it meant. If she survived, she'd lose both legs below a knee. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. "This ain't gonna be easy, but I'll do what I can." The single oil lantern cast long shadows across the cabin's rough-hewn walls as Thomas worked. He'd seen enough winters in Wyoming to know what needed doing, even if every step felt like driving nails through his heart. First, he had to get her out of those wet clothes. He kept his eyes averted as much as possible as he cut away the elaborate wedding dress with his sharpest knife, covering her immediately with warm blankets. The dress itself was a fine thing, or had been before the snow. Delicate lace and tiny pearl buttons, the kind of dress a woman dreams about. Now it lay in sodden pieces beside the bed, like the remnants of a broken promise. Thomas moved methodically, his weathered hands gentle but sure. He heated water from the snow outside, using it to slowly warm her core temperature. Her dark hair spread across his pillow as he worked, a stark contrast against her pale skin. The lantern's glow caught the gold of a wedding ring on her finger, and his jaw tightened at the sight. Someone had left her to die on what should have been the happiest day of her life. As he worked to save her, the storm raged outside, rattling the cabin's windows with its fury. Thomas tended to Buck briefly, bringing in his saddlebags and making sure the horse was comfortable in the lean-to. Then he returned to his vigil, feeding the fire, checking her pulse, and praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. Near midnight, she began to shiver violently, a good sign, though it pained him to watch. Her body was fighting back. He spoke to her softly. Words of encouragement carried on the warm air. "That's it, ma'am. You're stronger than this storm. Keep fighting." The real battle would come with her legs. Already, the line between frozen and living flesh was becoming clear. He'd seen men lose fingers, toes, even whole limbs to the merciless cold, but both legs. Thomas swallowed hard. She'd need a proper doctor, but the nearest one was 2 days' ride, and in this weather, dawn was breaking when she first stirred, eyelids fluttering. Thomas sat straighter in his chair, watching as awareness slowly crept across her features. Her eyes opened, dark brown he saw now, and fixed on him with confusion and fear. "Easy now," he said softly, keeping his distance, so as not to frighten her. "You're safe. My name's Thomas Cooper. Found you outside the chapel in the snow." She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. He helped her sip some warm water, supporting her head gently. "Sarah," she managed finally. "Sarah Mitchell. The wedding—" "Don't try to talk just yet, Miss Mitchell. You've been through an ordeal." But she persisted, her voice growing stronger with determination. "He left me there. Edward. He said he couldn't go through with it. Said he was sorry." A bitter laugh escaped her, turning into a cough. "Sorry. As if that made it right to leave me in a snowstorm." Thomas's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice steady. "Rest now, Miss Mitchell. We'll sort everything else out later." She started to nod, then froze as awareness seemed to spread through her body. Her face went even paler, if that was possible. I can't feel my legs." The moment he'd been dreading. Thomas took a deep breath. "The frostbite's bad, Miss Mitchell, real bad. When we can travel, you'll need a proper doctor, but I might lose them," she finished, her voice surprisingly steady. Their eyes met in the lantern light, and Thomas saw something there that made his breath catch. Not defeat, but a flicker of steel beneath the pain. "Yes, ma'am. I believe you will." Sarah closed her eyes, a single tear tracking down her cheek, but when she opened them again, that steel was still there. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, "you'd better start." "Calling me Sarah. Seems we're going to be spending some time together, Mr. Cooper." The following days brought a different kind of storm. As Sarah's body slowly recovered, the full weight of what had happened settled over her like a heavy blanket. Thomas watched her struggle with it, feeling helpless in the face of her pain. She'd stare at her wedding ring for hours, turning it around and around on her finger, lost in thoughts he couldn't share. One evening, as the fire crackled and wind rattled the cabin's windows, she finally spoke of it. "We were childhood sweethearts," she said, her voice distant. "Edward and I. Everyone said we were perfect together. His family owned the largest ranch in the territory. Mine had the reputation and connections. A match made in heaven." Thomas sat quietly in his chair, whittling a piece of wood. He'd learned that sometimes silence was the best encouragement. The wedding was supposed to be small, just family and close friends. The weather was turning, but Edward insisted we couldn't postpone. Everything had been arranged. She laughed. A hollow sound. I should have known then. He'd been acting strange for weeks, but I told myself it was just nerves. Her fingers found the ring again, twisting it. We were at the altar. The priest had barely begun when Edward turned to me. He was white as a sheet. Said he couldn't do. It said he'd made a terrible mistake. Her voice cracked. Then he told me about Mary. Thomas's knife paused mid-stroke. Mary? His ranch hand's daughter. They'd been together for months. She was with child, his child. Sarah's face contorted with a pain that had nothing to do with her legs. He couldn't marry me because he'd already ruined another woman's life, so he ruined mine instead. She pulled the ring off with sudden violence, flinging it across the cabin. It hit the wall with a tiny ping and fell somewhere in the shadows. I ran. Stupid, really. Ran out into the storm in my wedding dress like some tragic heroine from a penny novel. I barely remember. Falling, the cold, it was almost peaceful at the end. Thomas set aside his whittling and leaned forward. Sarah, don't. She held up a hand. Don't tell me it will be all right. Nothing about this is all right. I've lost my legs, my future, my place in society. Who will want me now? What will I do? Where will I go? The questions hung in the air between them, heavy as storm clouds. Thomas stood slowly, crossed to where the ring had fallen, and picked it up. He studied it in the firelight, a gaudy thing, he thought, with too many stones. First, he said carefully, you'll heal. Then you'll learn to live again, different but not less. As for who will want you, he met her eyes steadily. Any man worth his salt would be proud to stand beside a woman with your courage. Color rose in Sarah's cheeks and she looked away. You're kind, Mr. Cooper. Thomas, he corrected gently. And it's not kindness, just truth. He held out the ring. What do you want done with this? She stared at it for a long moment, then squared her shoulders. Sell it. When we reach town, sell it. I'll need money for whatever comes next. He nodded, pocketing the ring. They both knew it was a practical decision, but Thomas sensed it was more than that. A first step toward whatever new life waited on the other side of this tragedy. Rest now, he said softly. Tomorrow we'll start working on getting you strong again. The next morning, Thomas rose before dawn and set to work in the lean-to. The sound of his sawing and carving drifted into the cabin where Sarah dozed fitfully. By midday, he had fashioned a pair of crude crutches from sturdy pine branches, wrapped, with strips of leather from an old saddle for padding. They ain't pretty, he apologized, bringing them inside, but they'll help you move around. Sarah sat up straighter in bed, her eyes fixed on the crutches. She'd been propped up with pillows, some color finally returning to her cheeks. The doctor still couldn't reach them. The snow was too deep. But they both knew her legs were beyond, saving now. The frostbite had done its cruel work. You made these. For me? Her voice wavered slightly. Thomas shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. Figured you might be tired of that bed. Want to try them? The determination that crossed her face reminded him of a young horse he'd once trained. Eager but nervous, ready to try but afraid to fail. He helped her sit on the edge of the bed, supporting her as she found her balance. I've got you, he murmured. Just lean on me. Sarah gripped the crutches, her knuckles white with effort. The first attempt ended quickly, with her falling back onto the bed, frustrated tears in her eyes. But Thomas had seen that same determination before, Without a word, he helped her up again. On the fourth try, she managed to stand, swaying slightly. "I feel like a child learning to walk," she said through gritted teeth. "You're doing fine. Better than fine." Thomas kept one hand hovering near her elbow. "Want to try a step?" She nodded, face set with concentration. The first step was awkward, the second a little smoother. By the time she reached the cabin's small table, she was trembling with exhaustion but smiling. "I did it," she whispered, as if afraid speaking too loudly might break the spell. Thomas pulled out a chair for her, helping her sit. "You did, and tomorrow you'll do more." Over the next few days, they fell into a routine. Mornings were for exercises, Thomas helping Sarah strengthen her arms and core, teaching her how to move with the crutches. Afternoons, when she rested, he would tell her stories of his life on the range, of cattle drives and wild horses, of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "Were you ever married?" she asked one evening, as they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. Thomas stared into his cup for a long moment. "Once. Long time ago. Her name was Rebecca." Something in his voice made Sarah reach across the table, touching his hand gently. "What happened?" "Childbirth. Lost them both, Rebecca and the baby." He turned his hand over, squeezing her fingers briefly before letting go. "That's when I came out here, couldn't stand the sympathy in people's eyes anymore." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have asked." "No, it's all right. Been a long time now." He managed a small smile. "Besides, some things need to be spoken now and then. Keeps them from growing too heavy." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered outside, each lost in their own thoughts, but somehow less alone than before. As February stretched into March, the storms showed no sign of breaking. Thomas stood at his cabin door each morning, studying the heavy sky with growing concern. Their supplies, meant for one person through winter, were dwindling faster than he'd like. The flour barrel was half empty, the salt pork nearly gone. Even the coffee, his one luxury, had been carefully rationed to near nothing. Sarah noticed, of course. She'd grown more observant during her convalescence, learning to read the subtle signs of worry in Thomas's face. One morning, as he scraped the bottom of the flour barrel to make biscuits, she spoke up from her place by the fire. "I'm eating too much of your food." "Nonsense," he replied, not looking up. "Got plenty." "Thomas," her voice was firm, "don't lie to me, not you." He straightened, then meeting her eyes. "What would you have me do, put you out in the snow?" "Of course not. But I need to help somehow. I'm not completely helpless anymore." She demonstrated by pushing herself up with her crutches, moving to the table with growing confidence. "Teach me to cook, at least. You're terrible at biscuits." A smile tugged at his mouth despite his worries. She wasn't wrong. His biscuits could double as ammunition in a pinch. "All right. Show me how it's done, then." They worked together in the small space, her hands guiding his through the proper way to mix and knead the dough. The biscuits that emerged from the Dutch oven were golden and light, a far cry from his usual offerings. "See," she said, breaking. One open. Steam rose with a fresh, warm smell. Much better. But the moment of triumph couldn't entirely mask their situation. That evening, Thomas pulled on his heavy coat. "Got to try hunting," he said, checking his rifle. "Storms let up some." Sarah watched him prepare with worried eyes. "Be careful. Please." He nodded, touched by her concern. "Always am." The hunting was poor. Game had been driven deep into shelter by the endless storms. After 2 days of tracking through knee-deep snow, all Thomas had to show was a single scrawny rabbit and badly frozen feet. Sarah helped him warm them by the fire, her touch gentle as she checked for frostbite. "You're lucky," she said softly. "No permanent damage, unlike some of us." "Sarah, it was a joke, Thomas. Or trying to be." She sat back, frustrated. "I hate this. Hate being a burden. Hate that you're risking yourself because of me." He caught her hand as she turned away. "Look at me." When she did, his eyes were intense. You're not a burden. You're the reason I had warm biscuits waiting when I came in from hunting. You're the reason this cabin feels like more than just walls and a roof for the first time in years. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't pull away. What are we going to do? What we've been doing. Survive. Together. He squeezed her hand. Spring will come. It always does. The next morning, Sarah found herself alone in the cabin. Thomas, having gone to check on Buck in the lean-to, her eyes fell on her wedding dress, still lying in the corner where Thomas had placed it after cutting it away that first night. She maneuvered herself over on her crutches, then carefully lowered herself to examine it. The once pristine silk was stained and torn, the delicate lace edging stiff with frost damage. Like her old life, it was beyond repair. She fingered a piece of the fabric, remembering how proud she'd been when trying it on, how her mother had cried happy tears at the sight of her only daughter as a bride. That's how Thomas found her, surrounded by pieces of silk and memory, tears falling silently onto the ruined dress. "Leave it," he said gently from the doorway. "Nothing there worth saving." Something in his tone sparked an unexpected anger in Sarah. "Like me, you mean?" Thomas blinked, taken aback. "That's not what isn't it?" Her voice rose sharply. Poor Sarah, ruined like her dress. Best to just move forward, forget who she was, what she lost. Pretend she's not half the woman she used to be. "Sarah!" "No!" She grabbed a piece of the dress, clutching it to her chest. "You don't understand. This was my life. I had plans, dreams. I was going to be someone's wife, run a grand house, have children. Now what am I? A cripple dependent on a stranger's charity." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Thomas stood very still, his face unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "Charity, is that what you think this is? What else would you call it? Humanity." He moved closer, kneeling beside her. "Basic human decency, and maybe something more, though you're not ready to hear that yet." Sarah's anger faltered. "Thomas, no, you need to hear this." He picked up a piece of the dress. "You're right, I don't understand everything you've lost, but I understand loss, and I understand that this," he gestured at the dress, "isn't you. It's just fabric. You're still here, Sarah, still fighting, still teaching a rough cowboy to make decent biscuits, still making this cabin feel more like home than it has in years." He reached out, gently taking the silk from her grip. "You don't need this anymore. What you need is bandages. For your legs." Understanding dawned in her eyes as he began tearing the fabric into strips. "You want me to use my wedding dress for bandages? Seems fitting." His hands kept working, creating neat, clean strips. "Transform something that represents your pain into something that helps you heal." Sarah watched him work, her anger draining away like snow melting in spring. Finally, she reached out and took a piece of the dress, beginning to tear it herself. Together they worked in silence, creating a pile of makeshift bandages from the ruins of her past. "I'm sorry," she said eventually, "for what I said about charity." Thomas shook his head. "Nothing to be sorry for. Sometimes storms need to break before the sky can clear." She smiled slightly at that. "Is that cowboy wisdom?" "No, ma'am, just truth." Early spring sunshine began to filter through the cabin's single window, casting golden light across the rough wooden floor. Sarah sat at the table, bent over a piece of paper Thomas had found in the bottom of his trunk. She'd been writing for hours, her thoughts flowing onto the makeshift journal like a river breaking free of ice. Thomas watched her from his place by the fire, pretending to mend a bridle while stealing glances at her concentrated expression. The changes in her over the past weeks were remarkable. Her movements with the crutches had become sure and steady, her upper body strengthening from the constant use. But it was more than physical. There was a new light in her eyes, a purpose in her bearing. "What are you writing?" he finally asked, curiosity getting the better of him. Sarah looked up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "My story, all of it. The wedding, the abandonment, the storm." She paused, meeting his eyes. "The rescue. I thought perhaps, well, other women might draw strength from it someday." "They would," he said softly. "You're the strongest person I know." She laughed at that, a real laugh, one that filled the cabin with warmth. "A one-legged woman who can barely feed herself. A survivor," he corrected. "Someone who looked death and heartbreak in the face and chose to live anyway. That's real strength, Sarah." She considered this, tapping her pencil against the paper. "I never thought of myself as strong before. Back home, everyone treated me like fine china, something pretty to be protected and displayed. Even Edward," she shook her head. "Perhaps that's why he couldn't tell me the truth sooner. He thought I'd break." "His mistake," Thomas said, returning to his bridal work, "though I can't say I'm entirely sorry for it." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Sarah's pencil paused mid-word, and the cabin suddenly felt very still. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. Thomas kept his eyes on the leather in his hands, his weathered fingers working the stubborn straps. "Just that, if he hadn't been a coward, if he'd married you like he should have, you wouldn't be here, and this cabin would still be just a place to sleep between cattle drives." The pencil made a soft sound as Sarah set it down. "Thomas, look at me." He did, finding her eyes warm with understanding. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about what happens when the snow melts, about where I'll go." "You don't have to. Please let me finish." She took a deep breath. "I could go home to my parents. They'd take me in, of course, protect me again like their fine china. Or," Thomas's hands stilled on the bridle, or I could stay, help you turn this cabin into more than a place to sleep, if you'd want that." The bridle slipped from his fingers, falling forgotten to the floor. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the crackling of the fire and their own heartbeats. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "nothing would make me happier, but you should know, I ain't got much. This cabin, some cattle, Buck out there in the lean-to. I can't give you the kind of life you're used to." She smiled then, bright as the spring sunshine. "I'm not used to this life either, but I think maybe it's the life I was meant to find." A week later, Thomas returned from checking, his cattle with something clutched in his hand. He found Sarah outside the cabin, practicing with her crutches in the patches of ground where snow had melted. She'd grown confident enough to venture out on her own, though he still worried. "Found something you should see," he said, pulling a worn newspaper from his coat. It was several months old, but the headline caught Sarah's eye immediately. "Prominent rancher's son flees territory. Scandal rocks society circles." Sarah sank onto a rough-hewn bench Thomas had built near the door, her fingers trembling slightly. As she took the paper, the story laid bare all of Edward's sins, not just Mary and the baby, but years of gambling debts and mismanaged ranch funds. He'd fled east, leaving both women and a wake of financial ruin behind him. "My father's name is in here," she said quietly, scanning the article. "They interviewed him. He's offering a reward for information about my whereabouts." She looked up at Thomas. "They think I'm dead." Thomas leaned against the cabin wall, watching her carefully. "What do you want to do about it?" She studied the paper for a long moment. "Nothing, not yet." Her voice grew stronger. "Let them think I'm dead. The girl they knew, the one in silk dresses who never had an unpretty thought in her head. She did die in that storm. I'm someone else now, someone stronger." "Sarah," Thomas moved to sit beside her. "They're your family. They're grieving." "I know." She folded the paper carefully. "And someday I'll write to them, tell them I'm alive, that I'm—" She glanced at him, color rising in her cheeks. "That I'm happy, but not yet. I need more time to become who I'm meant to be." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the melting snow in shades of gold. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "Tell me about Rebecca," she said softly. "What was she like?" If the question surprised him, he didn't show it. "She was gentle, kind, loved poetry, used to read it to me in the evenings." A small smile touched his lips. "Nothing like you." "Oh?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "She was like a quiet stream, You're more like a mountain spring, stronger, wilder. He met her eyes, both beautiful but in different ways. Do you still miss her? Every day, he answered honestly, but not in the same way anymore. It's more like the memory of music, sweet but distant. His hand found hers on the bench between them. The present has its own song. Sarah's fingers intertwined with his, warm, despite the cool evening air. Thomas, what are we doing? Finding our way, he said simply, one step at a time. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. No rushing, no promises we're not ready to keep, just being here, together. The world transformed with spring's arrival. Snow retreated into shadowy hollows, revealing tender green shoots beneath. Sarah watched the changes from her favorite spot on the bench, marking each new flower that dared to bloom in the warming earth. She'd started keeping track of them in her journal. Tiny purple violets, bold yellow dandelions, delicate white snowdrops pushing through the last patches of winter. Thomas found her there one morning, carefully pressing a first spring flower between the pages of her journal. He paused to watch her, struck by how naturally she fit into the scene, her dark hair catching the sunlight, her movements sure and practiced, despite her disability. "We should plant a garden," she said without looking up, somehow knowing he was there. "Nothing fancy, just some vegetables, maybe a few flowers. The soil looks good here." "Never had much luck with growing things," he admitted, settling beside her. Sarah smiled, closing her journal. "Good thing you've got me then. My mother's garden was the pride of the territory. I learned a thing or two." "Your mother?" Thomas hesitated. "Have you thought more about writing to them?" "Every day." She traced the leather cover of her journal. "I've started the letter a dozen times, but how do I explain?" She gestured at her legs, at the cabin, at him. "How do I tell them that losing everything helped me find myself?" "Tell them the truth," he suggested, "about all of it, including us." Her heart skipped at the word us. They'd been dancing around it for weeks, this growing thing between them, neither wanting to rush, both afraid of breaking the delicate balance they'd found. "And what would I say about us?" she asked softly. Thomas reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her cheek. "That broken down. Cowboy found something more precious than gold in a snowstorm, that he's trying his best to be worthy of it." "Thomas." She leaned into his touch. "You've been worthy since the moment you carried me out of that storm." He shook his head. "I just did what any man would do." "No," she said firmly. "Any man would have taken me to town, left me with the doctor, gone on with his life. You stayed. You helped me rebuild mine." The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and promise. A warm breeze carried the scent of thawing earth and new beginnings. Thomas's hand slid from her cheek to the nape of her neck, gentle but sure. "Sarah," he whispered, "may I kiss you?" Her answer was to close the distance between them, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, then deepening like spring snow melting into mountain streams. When they finally parted, both were breathing quickly, and Sarah's eyes shone with something that put the morning sun to shame. "Well," she said, a smile tugging at her lips, "I suppose that's one way to tell them about us. The spring thaw brought more than just flowers. It brought decisions that could no longer be postponed." Thomas spread a weathered map across the table one evening, its creases deep from years of folding and refolding. Sarah leaned over it, her fingers tracing the inked lines of rivers and mountain ranges. "Nearest town with a proper doctor is here," Thomas said, pointing to a spot that seemed impossibly far from their tiny cabin. 2 days' ride in good weather. You need medical attention, Sarah, real medical attention, not just my rough doctoring." She nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the map. "And after? What then?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Thomas pulled up a chair beside her, their shoulders touching. "That depends on what you want. Could go to your family." He tapped another spot on the map. "Or there's a bigger town here, with better doctors, people who could help. You learn to be a cripple." The word was sharp, but her voice held no bitterness now. I already know how to be that, Thomas. What I want to know is... She turned to face him. Where will you be? Wherever you are, he answered without hesitation. If you'll have me... Sarah's hand found his, squeezing gently. I think you know I will. She looked back at the map. But I don't want to go to my family, or to some big town. I want to come back here. Sarah, are you sure? This life, it's hard enough with 2 good legs. The winters are brutal, the work never-ending. You'd be so far from everything you know. No, she corrected him. I'd be exactly where I belong. With everything I know now matters. She straightened in her chair. I'm not the same woman who arrived here in a wedding dress, Thomas. That life, parties and social calls and endless propriety, it feels like a dream now. This is real. You, this cabin, the work we could do together. Thomas studied her face, seeing the determination there. It won't be easy. Nothing worth having is. She smiled. Besides, I have plans. We could expand the garden, maybe start keeping chickens. With the money from selling my ring, we could fix up the cabin, add a proper porch, make it a real home. Our home, he said softly. Yes, she pulled the map closer. But first, I need to do this properly. We'll go to town, see the doctor. I'll write to my parents, tell them everything, and then she looked up at him, her eyes bright with purpose. Then I want you to marry me, Thomas Cooper. He blinked, startled. Shouldn't I be the one asking that? Probably. But I've already had one man make that decision for me. This time, I'm choosing for myself. Her voice softened. Unless you'd... Rather not, Thomas answered by pulling her into his arms, map crackling forgotten beneath her chair. Sarah Mitchell, he murmured against her hair. I've been yours since I found you in that storm. Marrying you would make me the happiest man in the territory. Good, she whispered, because I have no intention of ever letting you go. Dawn broke clear and cold the next morning, as Thomas worked in the lean-to, crafting something he'd been planning for days. The sound of his saw and hammer drifted into the cabin, where Sarah packed what few belongings they'd need for the journey. She smiled at the familiar rhythm of his work, remembering those first crude crutches he'd made her. Whatever he was building now, she knew it would be made with the same care. When he finally called her outside, she found him standing proudly, beside what looked like a small, sturdy sled mounted on wheels, a peculiar hybrid of winter and summer transport. It's not pretty, he apologized, running a hand over the rough wood, but it'll make the journey easier. You can ride here, he patted the padded seat, and we can strap our supplies beneath. Buck's strong enough to pull it alongside him. Sarah maneuvered closer on her crutches, touched by the thought and work he'd put into it. The seat was positioned so she could hold onto a railing for stability, and he'd even added a small canopy to shield her from the sun. You made this for me? For us, he corrected, helping her test the seat. Can't have my future wife getting too tired before we reach town. The word wife sent a warm flutter through her chest. It felt different than it had before, with Edward. Then it had been about fulfilling expectations, playing a role. With Thomas, it was about building something together, each bringing their own strength to the partnership. They set out as the sun cleared the mountains, Buck pulling the wheeled sled as smoothly as Thomas had hoped. Sarah sat tall in her seat, her hair braided back for travel, her mother's locket around her neck. Thomas rode beside her, leading Buck with practiced ease. The transformation of the landscape amazed her. What had been a blank white wasteland during her ill-fated wedding day was now a tapestry of greens and browns, dotted with early wildflowers. Life returning after the long winter, just as it had in her. Tell me about the town, she said as they followed the narrow trail. What are the people like? Good folks, mostly, simple but honest. Thomas adjusted Buck's lead rope. Dr. Jensen's got a good reputation, trained back east somewhere. His wife runs the general store. And they won't? Sarah hesitated. They won't treat me like some sort of curiosity. Thomas's face hardened slightly. They'll treat you with respect, or they'll answer to me. She laughed at his protective tone. My gallant defender. But I can fight my own battles now, you know. I know. His expression softened. You're the strongest person I've ever known, Sarah Mitchell. These past months have proved that. They made good time through the morning, stopping at midday to rest buck and eat a simple lunch. Sarah insisted on spreading their blanket on the ground so she could sit beside Thomas properly, her crutches laid carefully aside. "What are you thinking?" he asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About how different this is from my last journey. Then, I was heading toward a life everyone else had planned for me. Now," she smiled, taking his hand, "now I'm choosing my own path, with a man who sees me for who I really am, not who he wishes I was." Thomas squeezed her fingers gently. "And who are you, Sarah Mitchell?" "A survivor," she said firmly. "A woman who lost her legs, but found her heart. Someone who's not afraid of hard work or harsh winters, as long as she has the right partner beside her." She leaned against his shoulder. "Someone who can't wait to become Sarah Cooper." Their first real test came on the second day of travel. The spring weather, unpredictable as a young colt, turned against them. Dark clouds rolled in from the mountains, bringing with them a cold rain that seemed determined to work its way into every fold of clothing, every crack in the sled's canopy. Sarah huddled beneath the blanket Thomas had insisted she take, watching him ride through the downpour without complaint. His coat, still threadbare from the winter, offered little protection. Yet he kept Buck steady on the increasingly treacherous trail, stopping often to check the sled's wheels for mud. "We should stop," she called out finally, seeing him shiver. "Find shelter until this passes." Thomas shook his head, water dripping from his hat brim. "Next proper shelter's hours ahead. We push on. Thomas Cooper, you are not catching your death of cold on my account." Her tone brooked no argument. "There's a stand of pines ahead. We can wait it out there." He glanced at her, saw the determination in her face, and knew it was pointless to argue. The pines did offer some protection, their thick branches creating a relatively dry space beneath. Thomas helped Sarah from the sled, then worked quickly to create a makeshift camp. "Come here," she demanded once he'd finished, holding open the blanket. When he hesitated, she added, "Don't be stubborn. We need to share warmth." He settled beside her, and she wrapped the blanket around them both. His clothes were soaked through, but she pressed close anyway, sharing what heat she could. Gradually his shivering subsided. "You're getting better at that," he said softly. "At what? Taking care of me back?" She rested her head on his shoulder. "Get used to it. Marriage is a partnership, or so I'm told." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rain drum against the pine needles above. Sarah found herself studying his profile, the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, so different from Edward's smooth, pampered features. "I can feel you thinking," Thomas said, not opening his eyes. "I was just—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I was thinking how grateful I am that you found me that day. Not just for saving my life, but for showing me what real love looks like." Now he did look at her, his eyes soft. "And what does it look like? Like a man who builds crutches and sleds without being asked, who shares his last cup of coffee and never mentions the sacrifice, who looks at a woman with no legs and sees someone strong." She touched his cheek, feeling the rough stubble under her fingers. "It looks like you, Thomas." He turned his face into her palm, pressing a kiss there. "You make me sound like some kind of hero." "No," she said thoughtfully. "Heroes are for fairy tales. You're something better. You're real." The rain began to ease, sunlight filtering through the branches in scattered beams, but neither of them moved to break the moment. Sarah felt something shifting between them, like ice breaking up on a river, dangerous perhaps, but necessary for new growth. "Sarah," Thomas said quietly, "when we reach town, I want to do right by you. Get married proper, in the church, with witnesses. Give you at least that much of what you dreamed of." She shook her head. "My dreams have changed. All I want is you, a preacher, and maybe a dry day." She smiled. "Though I wouldn't say no to a new dress. One that's not quite so elaborate this time. You'll have it, And a ring that's yours alone, not a memory of someone else's promises. Just make sure it's simple, she said. Like us. He laughed at that. Simple? There's nothing simple about you, Sarah Mitchell. You're the most complicated, surprising, wonderful woman I've ever known. And yet you want to marry me anyway? More than I've ever wanted anything in my life. Millbrook came into view near sunset on their third day of travel, a cluster of wooden buildings and sturdy homes nestled in the valley like a handful of children's blocks scattered on a green blanket. Sarah sat straighter in her sled seat as they approached, smoothing her hair with nervous fingers. The town's notice board stood near the entrance, plastered with wanted posters, advertisements, and, Sarah's heart jumped, a missing person notice with her name and likeness. The reward offered by her father would have bought Thomas's cabin and land several times over. Ready? Thomas asked quietly, reining Buck to a stop. She nodded, though her hands gripped the sled's railing tighter. As I'll ever be. Their entrance did not go unnoticed. Heads turned as they passed, whispers following in their wake. Sarah kept her chin high, but she could hear the murmurs clearly enough. Isn't that Tom Cooper? Who's the woman? Did you see? She's got no... Hush, Martha. Don't stare. Thomas guided them directly to Dr. Jensen's house, which doubled as his practice. The doctor's wife, Emma, opened the door before they could knock, her round face creased with curiosity and concern. Thomas Cooper, as I live and breathe. We'd heard you were snowed in all winter, and now you show up with... She stopped abruptly, finally taking in Sarah's condition and the strange wheeled sled. Mrs. Jensen, Thomas said formally, this is Miss Sarah Mitchell. She needs your husband's professional attention, and we'd both be grateful for some discretion. Emma's face softened as she looked at Sarah. Of course, dear. Come in, come in. John's just finishing with another patient. The doctor's waiting room was warm and clean, if sparse. Sarah managed the transfer from sled to chair with practiced ease, though she noted how Emma's eyes widened at the sight of her missing legs. Thomas stood protectively nearby, his hat twisted in his hands. I'll just go fetch John, Emma said, disappearing through a door. They could hear her urgent whispers to her husband, though not the words themselves. They seem kind, Sarah offered quietly. Thomas nodded. They are, known them for years. They'll help. Dr. Jensen proved to be a tall, thin man with gentle hands and keen eyes. He listened without interruption as Sarah explained her circumstances, though she kept the details of her abandoned wedding vague and examined her legs with professional detachment. The original injury has healed as well as could be expected, given the circumstances, he said finally. Thomas's care probably saved your life, but you'll need proper prosthetics if you want more mobility. I can write to a specialist in Denver. We'd be obliged, Thomas said. How long would that take? A few weeks, most likely. You'll need to stay in town while we get the measurements right, and... He was interrupted by a commotion outside. Emma's voice rose in protest, followed by heavy footsteps and the door bursting open. A well-dressed man stood there, his face flushed with either exertion or drink. It is her, he declared to someone behind him. It's Mitchell's daughter. Sarah felt Thomas tense beside her. She reached for his hand, gripping it tight. This is a private medical consultation, Dr. Jensen said firmly, stepping between them and the intruder. I must ask you to leave. Leave? When there's $1,000 reward at stake? I think not. The man's eyes fixed on Sarah with naked greed. Your father's been searching for you, miss. Everyone thought you were dead after that storm. Wait till they hear where you've been all this time, shacked up with... He never finished the sentence. Thomas moved faster than Sarah had ever seen him, crossing the room in 2 strides. He didn't throw a punch, didn't need to, just took the man by his expensive coat and pushed him backward through the door. The lady, he said in a voice that could have frozen summer water, is under my protection. Spread whatever gossip you like, but if you ever speak to her disrespectfully again, you'll answer to me. Clear? The man sputtered, straightened his coat, and fled. Thomas turned back to find Dr. Jensen looking thoughtful and Emma hiding a smile behind her hand. "Well," the doctor said mildly, "I suppose you'll be wanting Reverend Parker's services as well as mine." Sarah lifted her chin. "Yes, we will, if he's willing to marry a crippled woman and a poor cowboy." "My dear," Emma said warmly, "in all my years of watching John patch up this town's troubles, I've never seen two people more whole than you. News travels fast in small towns. By morning, half of Millbrook knew that Sarah Mitchell, the missing heiress, had been found, and that Thomas Cooper aimed to marry her. The other half knew the embellished version, complete with wild speculation about her missing legs and Thomas's role in the whole affair. Sarah and Thomas were taking breakfast in the hotel dining room when the door flew open, bringing with it a blast of morning air and a face from the past. Edward stood there, his fine clothes travel-stained, his normally smooth features haggard. Sarah's teacup clattered against its saucer. Thomas half rose from his chair, but she laid a restraining hand on his arm. "Hello, Edward," she said calmly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "You're looking rather poorly for a man who inherited such a fine ranch." Edward flinched at her tone. "Sarah, they said you were here, but I couldn't believe." His eyes dropped to where her skirts lay flat below the knee, then quickly away. "Oh, what happened to you?" "What happened to me?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "You left me at the altar in a snowstorm. What did you think would happen?" The dining room had gone silent, every eye fixed on their table. Edward shifted uncomfortably. Aware of their audience, perhaps we could speak privately. "No," Sarah said firmly. "I think here will do fine. You see, I've learned something about secrets, Edward. How they fester in the dark, how they eat away at truth until there's nothing left but lies and pain." She drew the newspaper clipping from her pocket, the one Thomas had found, and smoothed it on the table. "Tell me, did you think no one would discover the missing money? The forged contracts? Or was Mary just a convenient excuse to run before it all fell apart?" Color drained from Edward's face. "You don't understand." "I understand." "Perfectly." Sarah's voice rang clear in the hushed room. "You didn't just betray me that day. You betrayed Mary, your family, everyone who trusted you. Then you ran, leaving us all to clean up your mess." "I came back," he protested weakly, "when I heard you were alive. I came back to make things right." "Make things right?" Now Thomas did stand, his quiet fury filling the room. "You want to make things right? Where were you when she was fighting for her life? When the frostbite took her legs? When she had to learn to walk again?" Edward took a step back from Thomas's anger, but Sarah wasn't finished. She pulled out a second paper, a legal document she'd obtained from the town clerk the previous day. "You'll sign this," she said, pushing it across the table. "It's a confession detailing your financial crimes. Sign it, and I'll make sure Mary and her child are provided for from what's left of your estate. And if I don't," Sarah smiled, and there was steel in it, "then I'll testify against you myself. Every detail, every fraud, every lie, your name, won't be worth dirt in any territory." Edward stared at her, seeing for the first time not the pampered society girl he'd left behind, but the woman she'd become. Wordlessly, he took the pen she offered. As he scrawled his signature, Sarah felt Thomas's hand on her shoulder, warm and supportive. She covered it with her own, drawing strength from his presence. "You know," she said as Edward straightened, "I spent months wondering what I did wrong, why I wasn't enough, but sitting here now I realize something." She looked up at Thomas, love and certainty in her eyes. "You didn't break me that day, Edward. You set me free, free to find a man who sees my true worth, free to become someone stronger than I ever knew I could be." Edward looked between them, something like understanding finally crossing his face. "You really love him, this cowboy, more than I ever thought possible," Sarah said softly. "He taught me that real love isn't about status or expectations. It's about choosing each other every day through whatever storms come." Edward swallowed hard. "I truly am sorry, Sarah, for everything." She nodded, accepting his apology with quiet dignity. "Go make things right with Mary, Edward. Be the man she needs you to be. That's all I ask." After he left, Thomas knelt beside her chair. "You're remarkable, you know that." Sarah touched his cheek tenderly. "I learned from the best. Now shall we go see about that wedding license? I think we've waited long enough." Thomas helped her back into her wheelchair, a temporary loan from Dr. Jensen until her prosthetics arrived. As they left the dining room, Sarah held her head high, aware of the watching eyes, but no longer afraid of their judgment. She had faced her past and emerged victorious. The future, with Thomas by her side, stretched before them like a bright morning after a long storm. The coming days brought change as swift and sure as spring floods. Word of Edward's confession spread through town, transforming whispers of scandal into murmurs of admiration for Sarah's strength. The house deed Thomas carried to Mr. Harrison's law office bore witness to their commitment. His entire savings, along with the money from Sarah's ring, put toward expanding their small homestead. "You're sure about this?" Sarah asked as Thomas signed the papers. "We could buy a place in town. It would be easier with my condition." Thomas paused, quill hovering over the document. "Do you want that?" She thought of their cabin, of mornings, watching wildlife from the front bench, of the garden she'd planned in her mind. "No, I want our home. I just don't want to make things harder for you." "Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice warm with affection, "nothing about loving you has ever been hard." Mr. Harrison, who'd been pretending not to listen, cleared his throat. "If I might offer a suggestion." He pulled out a map of the territory. "Cooper's land sits here, but this adjacent parcel just came available. Good water rights, gentle slope. Combined with your existing acreage, it'd make a fine ranch." Thomas studied the map. "That's more than I can afford, even with—" "I can afford it," Sarah interrupted. At their surprised looks, she explained, "I sent a letter to my parents yesterday telling them everything. Their reply came this morning." She pulled out an envelope. "They're giving me my inheritance early. All of it, Sarah." Thomas began, but she held up a hand. "Listen to me, Thomas Cooper. Everything I am today, my strength, my independence, my joy, I found with you in that cabin. But now it's my turn to help build our future." She took his hand. "Partners, remember? The deed they signed that day marked more than a land purchase. It was a declaration of their shared vision, their commitment to building something new together." The law office's window faced the town square, and Sarah watched people passing by as Harrison prepared the final papers. "Afternoon, Miss Mitchell," called Emma Jensen, walking past with a basket of fresh bread. "Oh, and I've finished those adjustments to your wedding dress. Simple and elegant, just as you wanted." Others waved too, the general store owner, the blacksmith, even the banker who'd been so skeptical of their plans at first. In just days, the town had shifted from viewing her as an object of gossip to accepting her as one of their own. That evening, Dr. Jensen fitted her first prosthetic leg. It was a temporary one, meant to help her adjust while waiting for the custom-made pair from Denver. The wood was smooth, the leather straps carefully padded. "It'll take time to learn," the doctor cautioned. "Don't rush it." But Sarah was already eager to try, with Thomas standing ready to catch her if needed. Her first step was ungainly, the second a bit steadier. By the 10th, she was grinning through her tears. "Look at you," Thomas whispered proudly. "Knew you could do it." "We're doing it," she corrected him. "Everything. Together." Later, sitting on the hotel's porch, they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. Sarah had insisted on walking the short distance, even though it left. Her tired and sore, every step felt like a victory. "Got the final plans for the cabin addition," Thomas said, unfolding a rough sketch. "Proper bedroom, larger kitchen, even a study where you can write." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, examining the drawings. "It's perfect. Though we should add a wide porch, for when we're old and want to watch the sunset. Already planning. On growing old with me. Obviously." She smiled up at him. "I need someone to fetch my legs when I'm too creaky to reach them myself." His laughter joined hers, carrying across the evening air. From the street below, Reverend Parker passed by, tipping his hat. 2 days, he called up to them. Everything's ready for the ceremony. Thank you, Reverend, Sarah called back. Then, softer to Thomas, are you ready to marry a stubborn woman who's likely to drive you crazy with her independence? More than ready, he kissed her temple. Are you ready to marry a simple cowboy who'll never be able to give you the kind of life you grew up with? You've given me something better, she said firmly. You've given me a life that's truly mine. Ours. Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, as if the Wyoming sky itself had decided to celebrate. Inside Emma Jensen's guest room, Sarah sat before the mirror, running her fingers over the simple ring Thomas had chosen, a plain gold band that somehow meant more than all the diamonds Edward had given her. Her new dress was everything she'd asked for, cream-colored cotton, elegantly simple, hemmed to accommodate her prosthetic leg. Emma had helped her practice walking in it, making sure she could move with dignity down the church aisle. You look beautiful, Emma said, pinning the last wildflower into Sarah's hair, and not just because of the dress. Sarah smiled at her reflection. I feel beautiful, not despite what I've lost, but because of what I've found. A knock at the door revealed, Dr. Jensen, ready, my dear, everyone's assembled. He patted the pocket containing the letter from Sarah's parents, which he would read during the ceremony at her request. They couldn't attend. Her father's health wouldn't permit the journey, but their blessing had come with enough love to bridge the distance. The small church was filled with morning light and familiar faces. Thomas waited at the altar, wearing a new shirt and his freshly polished boots, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. But when their eyes met, his face transformed with a joy that made her heart skip. Sarah walked down the aisle slowly, steadily, each step a testament to how far she'd come. She carried a bouquet of the same wildflowers that had first bloomed outside their cabin. Thomas had ridden out at dawn to gather them. Reverend Parker's service was brief, tailored to their wishes. When he spoke of weathering life's storms, together, of finding strength in each other's weakness, Sarah felt Thomas's hand tighten around hers. The rings you exchange today, the Reverend said, are circles without end, much like the love that brought you here. Not the fancy trappings of romance, but the deep current of devotion that carries us through both calm waters and rapids. Thomas's voice was rough with emotion as he spoke his vows. Sarah Mitchell, you came to me in a storm, and in saving you, I found my own salvation. I promise to be your shelter and your partner, to walk beside you through whatever weather life brings, as long as I draw breath. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she responded. Thomas Cooper, you saw me at my weakest and helped me find my strength. I promise to be your equal in all things, to face each dawn by your side, to make our love a light that guides us home as long as I draw breath. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss tasted of joy and wildflowers and possibilities. The small congregation's applause filled the church with warmth and acceptance. The celebration moved to the town square, where tables groaned with potluck dishes, contributed by what seemed like every family in Millbrook. Sarah lost count of the hugs and handshakes, the welcomes to the community, the admiration for her prosthetic, now decorated with ribbons to match her dress. Dance with me, Thomas murmured in her ear as fiddle music started up. I don't know if I can, she admitted. Sure you can. Just hold on to me. And so they swayed together in the afternoon sun, not quite in time with the music, but perfect in their own way. Sarah rested her head on Thomas's chest, feeling his heart beat steady and true. Happy? He asked softly. More than I ever thought possible. She lifted her face to his. You know, most people would say this isn't the wedding I should have had. No fancy dress, no elaborate feast, no society guests. Do you miss any of that? Not one bit. This is real. These people, she gestured at their neighbors dancing and laughing around them. They know us, really know us, and they're celebrating not just our marriage, but our whole story. Thomas brushed a kiss against her temple. It's quite a story. And it's only beginning, she said. Just wait until you see what I have planned for that garden. His laughter rumbled through his chest. "There's my Sarah. Not even married an hour and already plotting to change my bachelor ways." "Our ways now, Mr. Cooper." "Our ways, Mrs. Cooper," he agreed, and kissed her again, there in the sunshine, with their whole future stretching before them like an open trail. A month after their wedding, Sarah and Thomas crested the final hill leading to their cabin. The spring had deepened into early summer, painting their valley in shades of emerald and gold. Sarah sat proudly astride her own horse, a gentle mare. Thomas had helped her learn to ride with her prosthetic legs and drew in a deep breath of mountain air. "Home," she said softly, the word carrying all the weight of their journey. The cabin had changed in their absence. The new addition Thomas had commissioned was nearly complete, its fresh-cut timber gleaming in the sun, a proper porch wrapped around the front with wide steps just as Sarah had wanted. But it was the garden that caught her eye, a patch of turned earth waiting for her plans, for the seeds they'd bought in town. "Shall we?" Thomas asked, extending his hand to help her dismount. Sarah shook her head, smiling. "I can manage." And she did, with the grace that comes from practice and determination. Her new legs, crafted by the specialist in Denver, fit perfectly. She'd insisted on staying in town until she could walk confidently with them, knowing that life on their ranch would demand nothing less. Together, they led the horses to the expanded lean-to, which now had room for both their mounts plus Buck. Their movements were synchronized, the product of growing intimacy and shared purpose. When Thomas reached for a brush, Sarah already had, the curry comb ready to hand him. "The contractor left the house key under the mat," he said as they finished. "Would you like to do the honors?" Sarah's eyes sparkled. "Actually, I have a better idea." Before he could react, she stepped into his arms. "Carry me across the threshold." Thomas laughed, sweeping her up as easily as he had that first desperate day in the snow. "Thought you were all about independence now?" "I am," she said, rapping, her arms around his neck. "And being independent means I get to choose when to let you carry me." He pushed the door open with his foot, carrying her into their expanded home. The new rooms were rough, but full of promise, like a blank page waiting for their story to continue. Sarah's writing desk sat in the study corner, already laden with papers, plans for the ranch, letters to her parents, and the beginning of the book she'd promised to write about their journey. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cooper," Thomas murmured, setting her gently on her feet. Sarah turned in his arms, framing his beloved face with her hands. "We did it," she whispered. "Everything we planned, everything we hoped. We're just getting started," he reminded her, but she shook her head. "No, my love. We started the moment you found me in that storm. Everything since then has just been us finding our way home." Through the open door, sunlight streamed across their floor like a blessing. Outside, their horses nickered softly, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang of summer and new beginnings.